Before Israel started bombing Gaza, it was still seen as an occupier by the African countries. It's because Israel was established after wiping out Palestinians, occupying what was a complete Palestine. However, just a few years back, most countries in the African Union turned a blind eye to Israel and allowed it to be an observer member of the African Union. South Africa protested and tried to find more African countries that could defend not accepting Israel into the African Union. However, it could only find 3 African countries, while the rest of 55 countries remained silent. But South African Minister for Foreign Relations, Naledi Pandor, did not stop and continued her struggle to keep Israel, an occupier, out of the African Union. Now, we have seen something the whole world was waiting for. During a summit of the African Union, an Israeli ambassador was physically asked to leave. Security was called, and she was literally kicked out of the summit. But later, what the African Union did next was surprising for Israel, showing that African countries were not dependent on Israel. So what was done and how Israel was kicked out of the African Union summit in a historic showcase of African power? Let's know about that in this video. Back in 2002, the Organization of African Unity was dissolved, and the African Union was established in its place. Since 2002, Israel has struggled to be an observer member of the African Union, which is an organization with 55 African countries, much like the European Union. The membership was kept solely for African countries, yet Israel was trying to at least be an observer member. Finally, back in 2021, what Israel wanted became a reality. After nearly 2 decades of diplomatic efforts, Israel successfully secured observer status at the African Union. The official announcement of this achievement occurred as Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia, Burundi, and Chad, Al-Eliad Masu, presented his credentials to Moussa Faki Mohammed, the chairman of the African Union Commission, at the AU's headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid conveyed, "This is a day of celebration for Israel-Africa relations," stressing that Israel maintains diplomatic ties with 46 African countries. Israel had previously held observer status at the Organization of African Unity, but encountered challenges in reclaiming it after the OAU's dissolution in 2002 and the subsequent establishment of the AU. The Foreign Ministry stated, "This corrects the anomaly that has existed for almost 2 decades and is an important part of strengthening the fabric of Israel's foreign relations." The formal acknowledgement of Israel's observer status at the AU was anticipated to foster increased cooperation between the 2 entities. In a separate statement, Faki underscored the AU's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, reiterating the bloc's endorsement of a 2-state solution as necessary for peaceful coexistence. The statement highlighted Faki's condemnation of Israeli actions, including the bombardment of Gaza and attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem during a previous conflict. It is noteworthy that pro-Palestine sentiments are frequently expressed in statements at the AU's annual summits. Despite Palestine already holding observer status at the AU, Israeli diplomats voiced criticism regarding recent AU statements on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yes, that was the audacity with which Israel was moving forward. Instead of being grateful, it was trying to exercise its power on the permanent member countries of the African Union. Eba Kalondo, the then African Union's chairperson spokeswoman, disclosed that there were presently over 70 non-African embassies and non-governmental organizations accredited to the AU. Recently, at the commencement of the International Dilemmas of Humanity Conference, Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, made a profound statement by donning a Palestinian scarf. She revealed how Israel actually became an observer member of the African Union. Taking the stage, she delivered a speech on liberation that is poised to leave a lasting impact for generations. Pandor initiated her address by acknowledging the profound global turmoil, emphasizing her reluctance to sugarcoat the situation because it is undeniably challenging. She underscored that the world is grappling with a multitude of challenges. Her awareness of the global situation heightened in 2021 during a summit of the Executive Council of the African Union. She narrated the event that it came to her attention discreetly that the African Union Commission chairperson had extended an invitation to Israel to become an observer at the African Union, a revelation that deeply shocked her. In response, Pandor took decisive action. At the summit, she raised her hand and proposed the rescission of this decision. Despite garnering support from only 3 out of the 54 nations present, she remained steadfast in her determination that this decision would not prevail. Voicing her objection as a South African representative, Pandor adamantly stated that it should not be implemented, and South Africa would never accept it. While acknowledging the crucial role the Organization of African Unity played in South Africa's fight for freedom, anticipating widespread support, Pandor was disheartened to discover that oppressive countries, functioning as colonial occupiers, were leveraging financial influence to provide aid to African nations and secure depoliticized support. She explicitly singled out Israel as one of these oppressive nations playing a detrimental role in Africa. Pandor concluded by affirming her commitment to her role, asserting that as long as she is in office, the decision regarding Israel's observer status will not be enacted. What is happening now has proved what she said. In the past, when Israel announced its entry into the African Union as an observer state, there were varied reactions. This declaration encountered opposition from some member states of the African Union, who objected to the continental body granting observer state status to Israel, citing concerns about the country's occupation of Palestine. This disagreement highlighted a division within the Union and differing opinions on Israel's efforts to gain support and influence on the continent. For almost 2 decades after the OAU's disbandment, Israel's attempts to join the AU had been unsuccessful. But once Israel got observer status, it started to project its influence, something it is habituated to do. However, while observer status allows participation in the organization's activities, it does not grant the ability to vote or propose resolutions. Current AU observer members include Palestine Territory, China, the UK, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Mexico, and Greece. Several African countries, including Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, and Algeria, have opposed Israel's accreditation. They argue that AU member states weren't consulted, and the decision contradicts the body's support for the Palestinian cause. Reportedly, some predominantly Muslim Arab-speaking countries delivered a verbal protest note to Muhammad in Addis Ababa. South Africa, openly supporting the Palestinian cause, expressed dismay at the AU Commission's decision, likening the conditions of Palestine under Israel to the apartheid era in South Africa. This objection showed a division among African countries, with some potentially remaining silent due to historical ties with Israel, influenced either by pressure from the West or religious affiliation claiming a Judeo-Christian tradition. Furthermore, private Israeli companies have faced criticism on the continent, with accusations of certain countries using Israeli surveillance for domestic spying and allegations of spying on other African governments. However, the chair of the African Union defended the decision to grant Israel the observer status. But this decision was made unilaterally and authoritatively. In response to objections from AU member states, Mohammed asserted that the decision falls within his full sphere of competence without being tied to any preliminary procedure. He clarified that it was based on Israel's restoration of diplomatic relations by a majority of AU member states, and at the express demand of many member states to that end. Nevertheless, he emphasized the AU's support for the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, expressing hope that Israel's AU accreditation would contribute to intensifying the AU's advocacy for the principle of 2 states and the restoration of peace between Israel and Palestine. Later, 7 Arab countries, including Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Mauritania, Comoros, and Djibouti, voiced their objection to the action taken by AU Commission Chairperson Moussa Faki. They argued that the move is unacceptable at the discretion of the President of the Commission. It is a procedural and political violation, and violates the criteria for granting observer status to the African Union. This narrative also received support from Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Palestine, and Yemen, along with the Arab League delegation. The signatories rejected the decision made by the chairperson of the African Commission on July 22, 2021, citing political and sensitive concerns. They demanded a reintroduction of the debate over Israel's application to join the African Union at the next Executive Council session, led by an Arab effort supported by Algeria, South Africa, Nigeria, and other African countries, intending to revoke Israel's observer member status. The acceptance of Israel as an observer state in the AU stirred controversy within and outside the organization, given the objections of several member states to the unilateral decision made by AU Commission Chairperson Moussa Faki. Israel's requests to join the organization were rejected 3 times in 2013, 2015, and 2016. South Africa underscored that, in addition to political considerations, legal concerns play a role in rejecting Israel's application, as Israeli behavior is seen as conflicting with the values outlined in the African Union Charter. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Questions arose about how an organization supporting the Palestinian people's right to establish an independent state and urging Israel to adhere to international law can grant it observer status, especially when the request wasn't discussed with member states during the 34th session of the African Union Conference in February 2021. While the decision to accept Israel as an observer member of the African Union was a unilateral one by the African Union Commission, it reflected Israel's interest in the African continent and recent breakthroughs in cultivating ties with many of its countries and normalizing relations with others, including Arab nations. Israel established normal relations with Morocco and Sudan in 2020 and diplomatic relations with Chad in 2019. Chad is particularly significant given Moussa Faki's past role as Prime Minister from 2003-2005 and Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2008-2017 before he was elected chairman of the African Union Commission in 2017. After visiting Chad in September 2020 to discuss the possibility of opening a Chadian embassy in occupied Jerusalem and enhancing bilateral economic cooperation, former Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated, "Israel is coming back to Africa, and Africa is returning to Israel." This was a dangerous statement. In 2016, Netanyahu attempted to strengthen Israel's presence with a 4-country tour starting in Uganda, then Kenya and Rwanda, ending in Ethiopia. Israel allocated a budget of $13 million to strengthen economic relations with African countries. In October 2017, Israel sought to organize an Israeli-African summit in Lomé, Togo, bringing together African heads of state, excluding the Arab Maghreb. However, the summit was canceled, dealing a blow to Netanyahu's efforts to garner support for Israel's African Union membership project. Despite this setback, Israel continued to enhance its political, military, and intelligence influence, particularly in Ethiopia and Rwanda. Israel's presence was on the rise in Africa, once a staunch supporter of Arab causes during the initial decades of colonial liberation. Hence, a growing divide could be seen between the Arab region and Africa, with influential Arab powers, especially Egypt, losing influence in Africa to new African powers led by Ethiopia, which maintained close relations with Israel. That's when the efforts to expel Israel started. Just after less than 2 years of getting observer status, Israel saw itself humiliated by the African Union. In February of this year, a senior Israeli diplomat was expelled from the African Union's annual summit in Ethiopia as a dispute over Israel's accreditation to the bloc intensified. Security personnel escorted Ambassador Sharon Barley out of the auditorium during the opening ceremony of the summit in Addis Ababa on Saturday. Eba Kalando, the spokesperson for the African Union's chairman, stated that the diplomat was removed because she was not the duly accredited Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia, the official who was expected. This was a testimony of what African countries thought about Israel and what their next move could be. If earlier they had made a mistake and accepted Israel as an observer member, then now they were willing to make amends for that mistake. An AU official later informed that the diplomat who was asked to leave had not been invited to the meeting, with a non-transferable invitation issued only to Israel's ambassador to the African Union, Aleli Admasu. The official added, "It is regrettable that the individual in question would abuse such a courtesy." Perhaps Israel thought that the African Union was a loose organization where anyone could be sent, overruling all the organization's principles. But it was thought wrong, as within minutes, the African leaders noticed that an unknown person was sitting. Yes, she was an Israeli diplomat, but she was not given the invitation. Israel promptly condemned the move, stating, Israel looks harshly upon the incident in which the Deputy Director for Africa, Ambassador Sharon Barley, was removed from the African Union Hall despite her status as an accredited observer with entrance badges. Israel attributed the incident to South Africa and Algeria, alleging that they were holding the AU hostage and acting out of hate. Vincent Magwenya, spokesman for South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, demanded that Israel substantiate their claim after Israel accused archfoe Iran of orchestrating the move with help from Algeria and South Africa. Israel's foreign ministry announced that the charge d'affaires at South Africa's embassy would be summoned for a reprimand. South Africa rejected the claim, asserting that Israel's application for observer status at the AU had not been decided upon by the bloc. Clayson Monyela, head of public diplomacy in South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation, emphasized that it was not about South Africa or Algeria, it was an issue of principle. Palestinian groups welcomed Barley's expulsion, with the Fatah movement and Hamas stating that it aligns with AU support for their cause. Palestine already holds observer status at the AU, and pro-Palestinian sentiments are typically expressed in statements during AU summits. In February of the previous year, the AU suspended the debate on whether to suspend Israel's observer status, fearing a divisive vote. The then newly elected AU chairman, Macky Sall, announced that the vote would be postponed until 2023, with a committee established to consult with member states and build consensus on the matter. After one day, the African Union officially suspended Israel's observer status. This action followed the removal of Israeli Ambassador Sharon Barley from the African Union's annual summit in Ethiopia on Saturday. Barley had attempted to attend using a non-transferable invitation specifically designated for Israel's ambassador to the African Union, Aleli Admasu. AU Commission Chief Moussa Faki Mahamat informed reporters on Sunday that Israel's observer status was suspended pending deliberation by the committee. The spokesperson for Israel's foreign ministry defended Barley, asserting that she was an accredited observer with an entry tag, and accused the AU of being swayed by a small number of extremist states like Algeria and South Africa, which are driven by hatred and controlled by Iran. Now you can understand how Naledi Pandor successfully fought the battle. Even if she was one of the few at the summit to oppose Israel's observer status, she made an impact and encouraged more African countries to stand in this important matter of principles. Later, Pandor expressed surprise at the mention of South Africa in very pejorative words and stressed that she is not a security official at the AU. She found the notion of standing up and removing any person in a hall insulting and demeaning. Pandor underscored South Africa's objection to the Commission, chairperson's unilateral decision to grant Israel observer status in the Union, citing concerns about the occupation of Palestinian land, the construction of new settlements, movement restrictions, and discriminatory practices. She asserted that based on Israel not aligning with the values, principles, and objectives of the AU, South Africa has conveyed the view that Israel cannot be an observer in the organization. By removing the Israeli diplomat and suspending Israel's observer status, the very next day, the African Union showed the power it holds. Earlier, when the majority of African countries were supporting Israel's observer status, it was a representation of how weak the African Union had become. However, within just 2 years, the African Union rose as the most powerful organization, free from any external pressure. Israel was accepted into the African Union because most African countries were influenced by the US and European countries in one way or the other. Today, as African countries have skillfully handled this influence, they have done what they wanted from the very start: kick out Israel. The African Union wanted to publicly show that it isn't scared of Israel, a country that the West offers unconditional support to. You should know that the African Union announced the suspension of Israel's observer status within the bloc, signaling that no representative from Israel received an invitation to this year's summit. Despite this, Sharon Barley, the Israeli Foreign Ministry's Deputy Director General for Africa, managed to attend, resulting in her removal by security guards during the conference. This incident has stirred strong reactions in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, as Israel's observer status has been suspended, it might lose its capacity to exploit or manipulate African nations for its own benefit. While serving as an observer in the AU, Israel wielded a certain level of influence within the organization. This status permitted Israel to interact with member states and potentially advance its interests on the African continent. With the suspension of observer status, Israel's ability to directly influence AU proceedings could be significantly curtailed. Observer status often provides a country with a platform for diplomatic discussions and negotiations. Israel, with the loss of this status, might find it more difficult to leverage its position in engagements with African nations. This erosion of leverage could restrict its ability to secure concessions or favorable outcomes in diplomatic, economic, or political negotiations. Some argue that Israel's suspension sends a signal to African countries that they won't be vulnerable to potential exploitation or manipulation by Israel. The AU's decision could act as a deterrent, discouraging any attempts by Israel to use its influence for self-serving purposes at the expense of African nations. The AU's choice to suspend Israel's observer status may be perceived as a step toward fostering unity among African nations. By taking this stance, the AU demonstrates dedication to its principles and values, potentially thwarting external actors from exploiting divisions among member states. After getting observer status, Israel's next plan was to get permanent membership in the African Union. In that way, it could not only exploit African nations making agreements about their natural resources, but it could also act as an instrument for the West to ensure influence. In other words, Israel could be an alternative to France and a Western watchdog in Africa. But these ambitious plans have been thwarted now. What do you think? Should Israel be allowed to be an observer member of the African Union? Or was the suspension of Israel's observer status the right decision that was long overdue? Let us know your thoughts on whether African countries should engage with Israel, given that what Israel is doing with Palestinians is similar to what Africa faced during the apartheid era. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.